We're beginning Chapter 3 of Surprise, Kill, Vanish. The name of this chapter is called Surprise Attack in Korea. That the nation's new intelligence agency had failed to anticipate the invasion of an ally by communist forces put the CIA in a compromised position. President Truman blamed leadership and decided that CIA Director Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter had to go. To replace him, he called upon General Walter Bedell Smith, Walter Beadle Smith, I know that guy, who was physically unwell. The stress of having served as ambassador to Moscow had left Beadle Smith with a severe ulcer, and he'd recently undergone major surgery at Walter Reed to have 2/3 of his stomach removed. President Truman had previously offered him the job as CIA director, a position he had graciously turned down. Now, with the CIA at war in Korea, President Truman's request became an order, and Beadle Smith became the new director of the CIA. With a formidable figure now at the helm, the CIA's credibility and access to resources dramatically expanded. According to CIA documents kept classified for nearly 50 years, Korea became a testing ground for the support of conventional warfare with unconventional efforts, or black operations behind enemy lines. Walter Beadle Smith had no experience in covert operations, so he looked to outside experts. He chose them unwisely, he later learned. With black operations now at the fore, the CIA called upon the experience and talents of the Office of Strategic Services, dismantled by Truman in October 1945. Its members had hardly disappeared from public service. At the start of the Korean War, 1/3 of the CIA's total personnel had previously served in the OSS. I know nothing about this business, Beadle Smith confided to Admiral Sidney Sowers, the CIA's first director. I need a deputy who does. For the job of Deputy Director of Plans, a euphemism for Director of Covert Operations, he chose veteran OSS officer and future CIA Director Allen Dulles. In turn, Dulles filled the positions below him with veterans of the OSS. Frank Wisner, formerly OSS Station Chief in Romania, assumed responsibility for Office of Policy Coordination, Operations, and Staff. Wisner, or Wiz, as he was known among colleagues, was a complex individual, obsessed with rolling back Soviet gains. A former Olympic runner, he was now overweight and out of shape, years of heavy drinking and womanizing. He was under pressure from the FBI for having a wartime affair with a Romanian princess suspected of being a Soviet spy. His mercurial behavior was written off by colleagues and family alike as part of his personality. He seemed to be only half with us, always pondering some insoluble riddle, said his son, Graham. Nevertheless, he dominated every conversation with an extraordinary mixture of wit, charm, humor, and Southern power. What no one knew at the time was that Frank Wisner was in the early stages of mental illness and would eventually end his own life with a shotgun blast in the mouth. For now, he was in charge of planning and overseeing paramilitary action in Korea, sending hundreds, perhaps thousands of good men to their deaths. The black market he left on the agency still haunts. The black mark on the CIA he left on the agency still haunts the CIA today. Walter Beadle Smith mistrusted Frank Wisner, but he was stuck with him. In Korea, Wisner and his team began planning covert action operations. One of the first was an operation to infiltrate an agent into Pyongyang to assassinate North Korea's communist dictator Kim Il-sung. The operation was so sensitive it was personally handled by Wisner's deputy chief of CIA covert operations, a former OSS officer named Hans V. Toft. An enigmatic Hans Toft was an American citizen born in Denmark. At first glance, he appeared highly qualified for the job, fluent in Japanese, Russian, and Chinese. He had lived overseas in his 20s and had been recruited by the British Secret Intelligence Services in the early years of the war. When the OSS was created, Toft was assigned to its Special Operations Division. He had trained Jedburgh candidates Bill Casey and Aaron Bank in guerrilla warfare at Area B. Inserted into the war theater by parachute, he fought the Nazis behind enemy lines in Italy and Yugoslavia with valor. The King of Denmark knighted him. But like Frank Wisner, something had happened to Hans Toft in the 5 years since the end of World War II. His character transformed. By 1950, Toft was a liar and a thief. Was it post-traumatic stress, hubris, too much booze, the danger of covert operations, the danger of covert action operations, and the plausible deniability construct in which they exist was that it made it possible for ignoble actions to be easily concealed. Like Frank Wisner, Toft would ultimately experience a tragic downfall. Fired from the CIA for stealing classified information, he would die impoverished, his reputation in ruins. But for now, as Deputy Chief of CIA Covert Operations in Korea, Toft was in charge of running the assassination plot to kill Korean President Kim Il-sung. To do this, he oversaw 6 CIA operations who worked out of a hotel room in Tokyo. There were classified reasons why the CIA feared Kim Il-sung. To the intelligence community, he was the most dangerous kind of despot, a Soviet puppet. The CIA believed Kim Il-sung to be a top-ranking traitor who wasn't even who he said he is. According to a dossier entitled The Identity of Kim Il-sung, the man's real name was Kim Sung-ju. Analysts concluded. Excuse me. Orphaned as a child, he was said to have killed a fellow student while in high school. The circumstances of the murder were chronicled in his CIA file. Needing money, he stole it from a classmate, was caught, and feared possible disclosure, killed his classmate. The dossier read, it was around this time that the orphan Kim Sung-ju was identified by communist intelligence agents as someone the party could blackmail into use. The real Kim Il-sung had been a genuine war hero, a courageous guerrilla fighter who'd battled Japanese invaders in the Taektu mountain region of Korea during World War II. According to information in the CIA dossier, Stalin's assassins killed the war hero and disappeared him. This enables Stalin's minions to steal the war hero's identity and give it to the orphan boy. With a caveat, the imposter, Kim Il-sung, would now act as Moscow's puppet. In the fall of 1945, when Stalin appointed a man named Kim Il-sung to be Secretary General of North Korea, Communist Party, the identity theft was complete. Specific instructions were given to the leader of that regime that there should be no questions raised about Kim Il-sung's identity. The CIA learned, if the story were indeed true, North Korea's new leader was an exceptionally dangerous kind of tyrant, fundamentally beholden to the Kremlin. If Kim Il sung did not do exactly as instructed by the Politburo, his background as a murderous orphan, not a war hero, could be revealed. North Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, and Kim Il sung was dependent upon Russian patronage for his country's most basic needs. Everything he did was now in service to his communist masters, including the siege and subsequent large land grab of South Korea. The CIA's Office of Policy Coordination put North Korean President Kim Il sung at the top of one of its earliest known targeted to kill lists. Hans Toft received a cable from Washington. An assassin had been chosen for the job. Toft was to receive the CIA covert action operator in Tokyo, then oversee his infiltration into Pyongyang. The man was a Cherokee Indian codenamed Buffalo. Toft was a historian, Joseph Golden, after the war. As had Reinhard Heydrich's assassins, Jans Kubis and Joseph Gabkik, Buffalo had volunteered for the job. He'd been asked in Washington, "How would you like to kill Kim Il sung?" And he had accepted the mission with great pride, Toft recalled. Toft received instructions to meet the assassin near the wall of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo at sunset, at a designated time on a specific day. In keeping with the protocol of the day, Toft, carrying a briefcase full of cash from his office's unvouchered funding authority, met with the assassin to turn over initial payment. In the event Buffalo killed North Korea's leader, he'd received a grand prize of a considerable amount of money. The mission had failed and Buffalo was never heard from again. The idea that a Native American Indian, an assassin for the CIA, could simply make his way to Pyongyang in the middle of a war and blend in among the locals there was ambitious and foolhardily. It also set a precedent for what would eventually become known as lethal direct action, targeted killing, directed against a specific person either in peacetime or war. While the Hague Resolution prohibited assassination, Title 50, Covert Action Authority, made targeted killing legal, intended to counter the vicious covert activities of the USSR. The fabricated identity of Kim Il sung was a case in point, a Soviet covert act of deception directed against the United States. Through North Korea's supreme commander, Stalin could entangle the United States in a war on the Korean Peninsula. The Office of Policy Coordination began inserting CIA paramilitary teams deep inside Korea, behind enemy lines. The teams, led by Americans and made up of anti-communist Korean and Chinese nationals, were airdropped into hostile territory to conduct sabotage and subversion, including hit-and-run assassinations, similar to what the OSS had done during World War II. The results were disastrous, as explained by the man assigned to lead the CIA's parachute infiltration efforts, a former OSS Jedburgh named John Jack Singlaub. In 2016, Singlaub, 96, recalled these wartime tragedies with clarity and stoicism. Quote, One of the impossible imperatives of war in Asia was the Westerners could never simply disappear behind enemy lines into the civilian populations as we had done in Nazi-occupied Europe, Singlaub said. This was a tremendous challenge in Korea and an equally difficult problem in Vietnam. He was referring to the future war in which he would also play a significant role running covert action operations for the CIA. Singlaub would rise to the position of U.S. Army Major General. In 1951, Jack Singlaub served as CIA Deputy Chief of Station in Seoul, and his colleagues worked out of the newly renovated Traymore Hotel downtown. Their cover was that they were with an advisory organization called the Special Operations Group, SOG, Joint Advisory Committee, Korea, JAC. 8,132nd Army Unit, the cover name paid homage to the USS Special Operations Branch, and the unit became known simply as JAC. JAC's first commander, Singlaub's boss, was the CIA Chief of Station in Seoul, Ben Vander Voort, the legendary paratroop commander who lost one eye fighting Nazis in Holland. A month after Singlaub arrived, Vander Voort was called back to Washington, much to Singlaub's dismay. His reputation was a former CIA operative and Army colonel named Albert R. Haney, a man whose integrity would also come under fire, as had Wisner's and Toft's. Following a blueprint created by the OSS, the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination sought to organize an anti-communist guerrilla force it could train and equip for partisan warfare behind enemy lines. In Korea, Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC, officers combed through refugee camps in South Korea looking for local fighters qualified for paramilitary service, including North Korean and Chinese nationals. Back in America, dozens of college graduates were being recruited by the CIA to lead these covert action operations in the Far East. One of the young recruits was Donald P. Gregg, who was studying cryptanalysis, the study of hidden information systems. At a liberal arts college in Massachusetts, Gregg would eventually work for the CIA for 31 years. Gregg and a dozen of other new officers in training were sent to a clandestine, irregular warfare facility run by the CIA on the island of Saipan, a tiny dot in the Pacific Ocean 2,000 miles southeast of Seoul. There, hundreds of male Korean and Chinese refugees recruited from war camps underwent weeks of training in guerrilla warfare tactics. We were following the footsteps of the OSS, says Gregg, who later became U.S. ambassador to South Korea. But unlike veteran covert action officer Jack Singlaub, Don Gregg had no experience fighting wars, let alone using unconventional warfare tactics behind enemy lines. He'd only recently graduated from Williams College and barely knew where Korea was on the map. We didn't know what we were doing, he says, of his experience on Saipan. I asked my superiors what the mission was, but they wouldn't tell me. They didn't know. We were training Koreans and Chinese and a lot of strange people, Gregg called. The problem facing the CIA in Korea was twofold. Who exactly were the indigenous forces the agency was training? And could it be assumed that they too were in pursuit of American goals? A great majority spoke no English, an equal number were illiterate. How could the CIA identify a traitor under such circumstances? How could anyone know if a recruiter or volunteer was in fact a spy sent by the North Korean People's Army or the International Security Forces? Jack Singlaub had his own set of worries, more practical than theoretical. His Office of Policy Coordination colleagues, Frank Wisner and Hans Toft, were anxious to begin airdropping teams of CIA operators and their local forces into North Korea, behind enemy lines. As the man overseeing air insertion tactics, Sing Lao felt the pressure. He also worried about getting the men safely into the war zone. The Chinese were well aware of our airdrop operations and had learned to recognize the sound of low-flying transport planes that had an open door, he recalls. Sing Lao felt it would be safer to airdrop the operators into enemy territory from higher up. This would give them a greater chance of successful clandestine insertion, he believed. CIA covert action operations were being run out of a forward operating base, FOB, on Yeongdo Island in southwestern Korea. And it was there that Sing Lao began testing his new idea. Parachuting was my specialty from the OSS Jedburgh days, he recalls. He borrowed a B-26 light bomber aircraft from the Air Force, re-rigged the Bombay as a jump platform, and went out for a test. I told the pilot to keep his airspeed close to normal for a level flight, then jumped, assuming the same position I'd used to jump into Nazi-occupied France. Once he was out of the aircraft, he pulled his parachute and floated down to the ground. The test demonstrated we could use bombers for agent drops, he says. The success sparked another idea, a way to get a team in even more secretly. What if, he thought, instead of pulling his ripcord right away, he instead allowed his body to fall through the air, reaching terminal velocity, roughly 122 miles an hour or 54 meters per second, and then pull. This was long before the days of skydiving, back when the military had very clear protocols about how its paratroopers jumped, Sing Lao clarified. What he wanted to do now was free fall, then pull his ripcord, say 1,000 feet above the ground. While inherently more dangerous than a statistic line jump, free falling meant the enemy was less likely to see the agent's parachute as he floated to the earth. To test this idea, Sing Lao borrowed an L-19 Bird Dog from the Air Force. Accompanied by airborne specialist Captain John Skip Sadler, he made a series of test jumps, leaping out of the aircraft and having Sadler record the time before his parachute blossomed. After each test, Sing Lao waited longer on the next jump, thereby getting closer to the ground each successive time. Objects on the ground came into sharp focus within 1,000 or so feet. I watched an object on the road change from a blurred dot to what looked like a child's toy to an actual U.S. Army Jeep with a white star stenciled on its hood. I pulled the ripcord. Sing Lao's parachute opened and his feet hit the sand. Neither of us realized at the time that we'd invented the concept of high altitude, low opening, HALO, parachute drops, right there over Han River in Korea. The high altitude, low opening, or HALO jump has since become the most effective means of inserting covert action operators into denied territory and behind enemy lines. In 2019, it is still the method of choice. In Washington, D.C., a battle over covert action operations was underway between the CIA and U.S. Army. When war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, there was no Special Operations Force, SOF capability at the Defense Department. The military response was hesitant, skeptical, indifferent, and even antagonistic with regard to all aspects of unconventional or irregular warfare, says retired Colonel and U.S. Army historian Alfred H. Paddock, Jr. Most military leaders at the Pentagon wanted no part of these ungentlemanly black operations. Guerrilla warfare was frowned upon, says Singlaub. There were two notable exceptions. Leading a small group of guerrilla warfare pioneers inside the military establishment in 1951 were General Robert A. McClure, former director of the Psychological Warfare Division during World War II, and Colonel Russell D. Volkman, a former U.S. Army captain who led the only non-USS guerrilla operations during the war in the Philippines. What gave General McClure and Colonel Volkman momentum in their efforts was that both men had the ear of their former boss, General Eisenhower, now serving as the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. As per National Security Council Directive 10/2, covert action was to be the sole responsibility of the CIA during peacetime. Korea was different. This was war. Not technically. McClure and Volkman agreed. To me, the military had the inherent responsibility in time of war to organize and conduct special forces operations, Volkman told his commanding general. I feel that it is unsound, dangerous, and unworkable to delegate these responsibilities to a civil agency. That is the CIA. General McClure took a similar position. I believe the Army should be the executive agent for guerrilla activities, he told the Army Chief of Staff. I am not going to fight with CIA as to their responsibilities in those fields. In an attempt to alleviate the conflict, the Joint Chiefs of Staff created an Army organization to work with Jack, called CRAC, CCRAC, pronounced C-CRAC. In C-CRAC, documents located in National Archives, the organization's original acronym is revealed: Covert, Clandestine, and Relative Activities in Korea. And on-the-nose description of the U.S. Army's secret guerrilla warfare unit in Korea. As happened at the CIA, the name was quickly changed to something more innocuous. C-CRAC became Combined Command Reconnaissance Activities. Korea. An operations base was set up on Bangyang Island off the coast of South Korea near the northern limit line. The unit assigned to work with the CIA's Jack was originally called the Guerrilla Section, 8th Army Miscellaneous, but this name was also deemed too revealing. It was changed to the United Nations Partisan Infantry Korea, UNPIK. That the Army was vying for power over covert operations infuriated the CIA's Frank Wisner. The CIA informed the Deputy of Defense of its displeasure. Mr. Wisner, as head of Office of Policy Coordination, would like it to be clearly understood that this understanding is reached on the assumption that the Army is creating a Special Forces training command for its own purposes and not at the request of CIA, agency officials wrote in a now declassified memo. Theirs was a temporary wartime gesture in cooperation. The CIA is not going to place itself in the position of giving the Army an excuse to justify the creation of its own unconventional warfare capability. Once the war was over, agency officials demanded that covert action authority be returned to the CIA. The aversion to risk was perhaps the single greatest discrepancy between CIA and the Pentagon. The CIA was about taking chances. Its officers and operators were trained to act as the president's hidden hand. Covert action operations are meant to remain forever hidden from public scrutiny. In the event one becomes known, plausible deniability becomes the goal. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the United States military, an organization that follows strict procedures and protocols. Its classified and clandestine operations might be kept secret for a period of time, but eventually they are meant to be revealed. One of the biggest obstacles I faced in Korea, says Singh Laub, was the Pentagon's worry that these paramilitary units might be captured, broken by physical or psychological torture, and turned against us for propaganda purposes. Unlike CIA officers, the Pentagon's soldiers are not explicitly trained how to lie. Jack and Seacrack's guiding principles were, however, ultimately the same. Each organization was born of the OSS, with foundations in guerrilla warfare. A manual entitled Psy-War 040 CIA was given to both sets of operators to study and learn from. Hit and run. These are the guerrillas' tactics, its authors explained. Primary objective, the killing and capture of personnel, sniping and demolitions. Initiative and aggressiveness tempered by calm judgment will be encouraged. Avoid trying to win the war by yourself. Colonel Douglas C. Dillard, a 26-year-old infantry officer from Georgia, was put in charge of delivery and resupply of these joint CIA Army airborne operations, codenamed Avery. The missions were kept classified until 2009, although some took place early in the Korean War. The scale of operations rose dramatically starting in February of 1952. One of Avery's first missions ended in disaster, Colonel Dillard recalled in 2009. It was the winter of 1952, a period of time known as the Second Korean Winter. Now, 20 months into the war, a dismal lull had settled over the battlefield, with fighting diminished to violent small unit clashes and struggles over key outpost oppositions along the front lines of Korea's hilly landscape. Hundreds of Americans had been captured and were being kept under brutal conditions inside prisoner of war camps. The joint CIA Army mission on the night of February 18th, 1952 was designed to airdrop paramilitary operators who would gather reconnaissance on a prisoner of war camp and then exfiltrate by ground. The missions were dangerous. Territory above the 38th parallel was notoriously inhospitable. Unlike with the OSS Jedburgh airdrops into France, there'd be a very limited greeting party on the ground, maybe one or two anti-communist partisan agents. Radio communication did not exist in outer reaches of this landscape, so agents were dropped in with homing pigeons strapped to their legs. This was often their only means of communicating with their CIA and U.S. Army handlers in the South. A single homing pigeon to let the handler know they'd made it safely in. The rate of return was incredibly low, recalls CIA historian John P. Finnegan. New tradecraft techniques were constantly being developed and tested. On this mission, the covert action operators wore uniforms and carried Chinese-made weapons. They could impersonate enemy patrols and, if necessary, shoot their way back to UN lines. Dillard explained, but there was a much bigger problem facing the unit. One everyone knew about and few wanted to discuss, says Singh Laub. How do you trust that the indigenous agents you are paying will not try and kill you? A traitor in the ranks almost certainly meant death. It was the early morning hours of February 19th, 1952, and Air Force Captain Lawrence E. Berger was piloting a C-47 south of Woznan, North Korea. There were two missions on deck, both covert action operations, both parachute infiltrations of American, Korean, and Chinese national paramilitary teams behind enemy lines. Given the limits of given the limits on usable aircraft, it was common to run more than one mission per flight. Master Sergeant Davis T. Harrison stood in the door with the 4 anti-communist Chinese agents he was running, preparing them for a static line jump. The partisans had been culled from a refugee camp down south and trained for action by CIA paramilitary forces. They all stood in the doorway, ready to jump. 3 of the Chinese guerrilla fighters were big, 1 was small. Each man stood the proper distance away from the next, ripcords attached to the static line. It was best to have the smallest man jump first, Sergeant Harrison later told a military investigation board. But this particular man made such a fuss about jumping out last, and the situation gave Harrison pause. But Harrison didn't speak Chinese, and the partisan agent didn't speak English. An ongoing problem with covert operations inside Jack. The general rule in these kinds of intense moments was to be flexible, think fast. Seated in the aircraft, Sergeant Harrison observed Private First Class Dean H. Crabb, his fellow covert action operator. Crabb was seated next to the 4 anti-communist guerrilla fighters working under his authority. This team would be making the next jump even deeper behind enemy lines, almost 100 miles north of what was about to be the first airdrop. It was 1:45 a.m., pitch dark outside, and well below zero. Sergeant Harrison scanned the ground down below for a sign. The way signaling worked out there was that when anti-communist partisans on the ground heard the airplane approach, they would ignite small fires inside metal buckets to briefly illuminate the drop zone. Harrison stared down into the darkness below. The snow was fierce. There were big winds, freezing temperatures, and the threat of anti-aircraft fire from enemy forces on the ground. At last, he spotted a faint cluster of signal fires. Harrison alerted the pilot, Captain Berger. The mission was now a go. Captain Berger banked the aircraft and made a wide circle, lowering his altitude as the CIA's Avery team prepared to jump. The first Chinese partisan moved to the door. Harrison gave the rebel fighter the go-ahead to jump and watched as the man leapt out into the air. The second man quickly jumped. When the third man hesitated, Harrison knew intuitively that something was terribly wrong. Instead of jumping, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a grenade. He yanked the pin and rolled it into the seating of the aircraft and leapt out into the night air. David T. Harrison was instantly blown out of the aircraft. Assistant Jump Master Corporal George Takartis was also jettisoned from the burning plane. Dean Crabb and his team of 4 Chinese partisans were killed instantly by shrapnel and blast. Captain Berger struggled with the crippled aircraft, ordering his 6-man crew to bail out while he worked to keep the aircraft steady. The men, later identified as Roden, Layer, King, Dick, and Haley, somehow managed to bail out. Captain Berger stayed at the controls of the airplane until it crashed into the mountain range below. Master Sergeant David Harrison and Corporal George Takartis, both wearing parachutes, pulled their ripcords before hitting the ground. Both landed safely, as did the 5 members of the crew. Everyone but Harrison was captured by the North Korean army. Harrison evaded capture for 24 hours, sneaking into a house and asking for help. The family offered him sanctuary, but, while he was sleeping, notified the North Korean army, which came and took Harrison away. Each of the covert action operators and the aircrew died, or were killed in prisoner of war camps in the North. Harrison's body was repatriated after the war. The mission was but one of dozens of disastrous operations, all kept classified for decades, the great majority of which amounted to a tragic intelligence failure. Thousands of anti-communist foreign fighters and their American handlers were dropped into North Korea, never to return. These were suicide missions, concluded Peter Scheisel, CIA station chief in Hong Kong. Many of the operatives recruited by the Office of Policy Coordination from refugee camps turned out to be double agents. If program organizer Frank Wisner, Hans Toft, and Albert Haney were naive to the double cross in the beginning, declassified documents made clear that as early as 8 months into the war, they understood what was going on. Their intelligence was thin, spurious, or feigned, but the trio continued winging it, sending volunteer operators to their graves. They reported mission success instead of abject failure. The result was the death of what the CIA now concedes amounted to hundreds, perhaps thousands of men and women. At the Pentagon, General McClure and Colonel Volkman blew the whistle internally, but the damage could of course not be undone. The experience transformed McClure's reservations into outright suspicions about the CIA's motives, wrote Alfred Paddock. Hans Toft was replaced in Korea by career CIA officer John L. Hart. Upon reviewing classified documents that Toft kept in his office, Hart became outraged and notified CIA Director Walter Beadle Smith. The results of our investigation surpassed our most pessimistic expectations, he later explained. Countless intelligence reports merely fabricated by people living in Seoul. Beadle Smith sent his deputy, Loftus Becker, to Seoul to tell the CIA's John Hart that the agency could not afford a scandal. With its reputation not yet established, Becker told Hart the CIA simply could not admit to other branches of government, least of all the highly competitive U.S. military intelligence services, its inability to collect intelligence on North Korea. The intelligence agency can't collect intelligence. Hart's reports were classified, so were Operation Avery's catastrophic losses. Devastated by the deception, Loftus Becker resigned. The North Korean covert action operations would remain a secret failure for decades. Haney, Toft, and Wisner moved on to a new covert action operation. This time in Guatemala. The CIA had failed in Korea because it entered the game too late and had no reliable network of agents on the ground. In Guatemala, the plan was to be preemptive, fix things before they happened. This doctrine would become known as a regime change. General McClure wrote to his commander, General Charles Bolt, with his analysis of the situation. I would take the opportunity to bring you up to date on the Army / CIA relationship, McClure explained. In recent conferences at CIA, I have heard it said, since we are now a fourth service, many of the activities for which the Army was planning should be transferred to CIA, including the command of military forces designed for guerrilla warfare in time of war. Needless to say, I am very unhappy about it both because I question the ability of CIA, and second, because I have never believed the Joint Chiefs intended to abrogate their responsibilities for the active command of military operations in times of war. Hey Siri, define abrogate.
Abrogate is a formal term. It means
Repeal.
or do away with a law, right, or formal agreement.
Abrogate, to repeal or do away with. Now okay, here we go. At the CIA, Walter Beetle Smith was also concerned. In a letter to Ludwig Lee Montague, his advisor on the National Security Council staff, Smith expressed fear that his covert action deputies, Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner, could lead the CIA into some ill-conceived and disastrous misadventure. But the horse was already out of the barn. The CIA's covert action operation budget had expanded to become 3 times the size of the agency's budget for intelligence and espionage combined. It was a catch-22. The CIA needed to train and equip partisans in order to form guerrilla warfare corps on the ground. This underground army was a necessary component in supplying the CIA with intelligence that would keep its agents from being killed. But in reality, the amount of intelligence that could be gathered from inside a totalitarian state like North Korea was close to nil. The possibility of recruiting and running any such sources was as improbable as placing resident spies on the planet Mars, lamented former OSS officer Richard Helms, Frank Wisner's deputy and future director of Central Intelligence. Beetle Smith considered curtailing CIA covert action operations. Too many paramilitary operations pose a distinct danger to CIA as an intelligence agency, he told his staff. Something had to change, or he feared. The covert action operational tail will wag the intelligence dog. But Beetle Smith was fiercely loyal to the agency that he was in charge of, and in a letter to the National Security Council on the subject of covert action, he conveyed a far less dramatic position. At certain times in the past, we have been importuned by General McClure's people to provide them with detailed information concerning guerrilla groups of which we may have some knowledge, he wrote. We have consistently declined to furnish this information to General McClure because the information requested impinges directly upon secret operations in which we are currently engaged and for which at this time we are solely responsible. In his summary, Beetle Smith played the secrecy card. In a CIA analysis of its Korean War operations, kept classified for 50 years, the agency made it clear that it understood its paramilitary operations to be not only ineffective, but probably morally reprehensible in the number of lives lost. The Avery missions were doomed from the start, it concluded. The CIA had no reliable way to discern its enemies from its friends. The amount of time and treasure expended was enormously disproportionate to that which was gained. Jack's classified missions in Korea were water under the bridge. By the end of the war, the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination had built an organization capable of executing covert action on a worldwide scale. An untold number of covert action operations would now begin. While Jack and Seacrack were running dangerous black operations behind enemy lines, a traditional war was also being fought by U.S. Army soldiers on the ground. The oft-cited example of this kind of warfare was demonstrated in the trenches of World War I. Korea had become a war of attrition, a military strategy whereby each side wears down the other side through continuous, relentless loss, grinding down the enemy's morale. Like stags fighting with their horns locked, neither side could win. The end foreseen becomes not victory, but collapse. One of the foot soldiers fighting the Korean War of attrition was Billy Wah. Now a 21-year-old platoon sergeant with the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. He'd earned his wings with the 82nd Airborne, just as he said he would, with his Browning bar rifle over his shoulder and his army boots laced up tight. Wah remembers the demoralizing monotony he felt marching across the frozen land bored out of his mind. I wanted action. I wanted to fight. I wanted America to win the war. But none of this was happening in his infantry platoon. The war in Korea was not the kind of Billy Wah envisioned for himself. He wanted to win a glorious victory, like the one earned against Germany and Japan. In Korea, the first casualty of war Wah remembers seeing was a half-frozen civilian lying face up, dead, along the side of the road. We'd marched up over one hill with great expectations of meeting the enemy and finally engaging in fierce combat, he remembers. Instead, from the top of one hill, we'd look across a treeless landscape, and all we'd see was the next hill. It was trench warfare, the worst, most baseless form of combat. War by grinding down. I wanted to see combat, to be brave under fire. Soon Wah would have his wish. During a chance encounter on a train, he'd learned about secret wars being conducted by the U.S. government as covert operations behind enemy lines in what would become known as denied areas. Billy Wah would spend the next 7 decades, until at least 2011, engaged in or training for direct action or kill or be killed covert operations against America's enemies around the globe. He would train and equip guerrilla fighters, lead hit and run ambushes, conduct sabotage against infrastructure, and assassinate. Trudging across Korea's striped and frozen earth, he foresaw none of this. All he knew was that General Sherman seemed about right. The glory of war was moonshine. War, at least this wretched war of attrition in Korea, was hell.